Welcome. Welcome to this conversation. That's what it is. And you are a partner in this conversation. So just join with us and think about these questions and the concerns and make your own comments about stories. And because that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about stories and life. And we're very pleased to have as our conversation partner Gus Jordan. Gus works at the college and has a very important position, and I'm going to let him tell you his title so I get it right.
My actual title, and it's good to be here, by the way, is Executive Director of Parton Center for Health and Wellness. What that really means is I oversee the health center on campus, the counseling center, and the sports medicine department. So a really great group of, great team of people who help look after the health and well-being of our students at the college.
I'm so glad you did that. Let me ask you a question. I've heard you as a public speaker many times, you with children, with intergenerational, with from notes, from manuscript, and without notes, I think. So, as a public speaker, what place does story take in your life when you're working on the things that you do?
Yeah, it's interesting you mention stories, for example, with children, which is one of the places that I really enjoy that genre, the way to enter in that really directly. But it also applies with adults as well. I think that it's about connecting a person to the narrative of the story that you're helping them walk through. But usually there's a bigger, grander purpose going on, which is also to, in some ways, connect the person, the child or the adult or whoever you're talking with, to their story. How does what we're talking about link us together in a shared narrative of experience? That's what I'm often thinking about when I'm sort of putting these together, whether it's a children's story or a sort of public conversation about something important topic or something like that. Those are the kinds of things that are kind of going on in the back of my mind as I'm preparing or thinking about it.
Thank you. That's helpful. You also spend time as a counselor and clinician. I don't know what the right title is, which means you spend time listening. So, what's the role of listening in stories?
That's really where I spend a lot of my time, is to be in a room with someone who has something really personal or important to talk about that's deeply personal within their life. It may be a struggle or a painful experiences or anxieties about the future, and people are trying to sort out their own story at that point. They are thinking about where they are coming from and what those experiences have been, but how that connects them to the future, and the role that emotion and particularly pain plays in the way they've constructed their own story about themselves, but also about where that goes, where that heads into the future. And so when I'm listening for both the emotion that's a part of their experience, helping a person to articulate their emotional life, and also how that connects with what their intentions are for their future. So what is it that they want for themselves moving forward? And that's usually can be expressed in narrative form. What does that look like? The sort of arc of one's life. And I spend time with people at different points in their lives. Right now it's usually with students who are in that 18 to 21 year range. And they are very active in thinking about what their life means, where it's headed. They're anxious about that, but excited about that. So part of my role is to invite the student, the person, to be open to their own experiences, to have those expressed, have there be room, space for that to occur between the two of us, so that they can hear their own story and begin to think about, is this the story I want to be telling in my life? Is this where I want to be headed? It's a really great honor to be able to be listening to someone else tell the deepest and most important things about their life. So that's kind of where that connects for me.
Yeah. I think about an old adage that says, without someone to listen, there's no story. And in a sense, then, listening begins before the story, and it encourages the story to come out.
I think that's exactly right. It's a place where one feels heard, one feels validated. You don't even have to agree with another person's perspective or opinion, or even what their own goals or aspirations are, to appreciate where they are. And I think that sense of appreciation, that sense of being present with them as they tell what's happening in their life, I think that makes all the difference. I think that happens in the counseling setting, but it also happens, I think, in our interactions with each other, whether it's after a meeting that we've been to, or and we're just chatting with each other about our lives and our experiences, just to sense that someone wants to hear what you have to say opens that door, I think, for a person to talk.
Can you go back to your earlier days and say to yourself, I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I was a child, and I first became aware of stories, or I first found somebody that I really enjoyed because they told stories. Can you share some of that?
I think that for me, it was hearing stories about my father's childhood that had some of the biggest impact upon me. And I would hear those stories either sometimes from him. He would relate, an experience that he had, but sometimes from my grandmother, Grandma Sarah, in Pelham, Georgia, South Georgia. She was a remarkable woman, well educated for her generation, and she would also invite me into some of the narrative around being Southern, being in that part of the world, and around my father's history. And that was particularly meaningful for me. I looked up to my father and had a lot of respect for him. He tended to be a quiet man, and so when he spoke, people tended to listen, and I certainly did. And so it was some of the stories. He had hilarious stories and funny stories, and just rich experiences. And they tended to be stories that sort of went against the grain a little bit, challenged your assumptions about who he is or who we are as people together, and for me, in many ways, opened life up a little bit, pressed against sort of rigid boundaries or expectations of how we're supposed to behave. And again, he was a quiet man who was a professional, but when he would tell those kinds of stories, I would get a glimpse of something very different. I think that's where, for me, the germ of interest in this really began. Well,
Can you remember a particular story?
Sure. I can go on and on, so you'll have to stop me.
Go ahead.
I'll start.
That's fine.
One example is he was particularly fascinated by fire. And I experienced that with him as a child because he taught me how to make gunpowder. He had a contraption, very complicated contraption, that would turn lye and the acid and aluminum into hydrogen gas, which he would use to fill up balloons with hydrogen gas, which was interesting in its own accord. But then we would blow them up. We would get fire next to them and explode them. Okay, so that, just to go back, when he was, I don't know, 10 or 11, he got a tent for his birthday. His father helped him set it up in the morning. His father went off to work, and he was out there playing with this tent. Well, in those days, tents were flammable. They were not. They weren't protected. He got inside the tent, and he looked up, and there was a string hanging down from from the top of the tent. And for some reason, he thought it would be interesting to see what happened if you lit that string. So he lights the string, and of course it immediately goes to the top. The top of the tent catches fire. He barely gets out of the thing. It burns to the ground. And there it is, his brand new tent for his birthday burned to the ground. His father comes home and is like, his name was also Gus. I'm Gus Jr. So his father says, "Gus, what happened to your tent?" And my father says, "I don't know." And then he says, "Well, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to spank you now." And my father's like, "Oh my gosh," he says, "but not because you burned down your tent. You should just have told me that's what happened, but because you lied to me about what happened." And so this became a sort of apocryphal story in our family, like about the meaning of telling the truth with each other. That you can do things that are, you can make mistakes, you can burn a tent down to the ground. But what does that mean in our relationships with each other? And that was the way his stories had a tendency to draw us back to what's our relationship with each
So
other.
that story lives and lived for a long time,
Absolutely,
right?
yep, it absolutely.
And had an impact that you probably he couldn't have anticipated.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Well, what about Grandma? I mean, she taught you about the Southern way of life. Can you say something about
Sure,
her?
absolutely. This was in South Georgia. She raised a family there. She went to college, which was unusual for again for a person in the early 1900s, and in a small town. Raised her family there, but they had to deal with heat. It's very, very hot in the South, and certainly that part of the South. And so the stories that I would hear about her and ways that she would sort of invite me into that world. One is that she and her husband would take the children before bed, and it was so hot, and they would spray them with water in their pajamas, and then they would climb into bed damp, so that the water would, as it evaporated off their bodies, off of their pajamas, would cool them down at night. So it's that kind of thing, just sort of inviting you into that world. In the back of their house, there was a big porch on the back, and there was an old smokehouse back there that they didn't really use anymore by the time I was a child. But she would take us in, and the smell and feel of that space was just brought you into a different world. I grew up in Atlanta. We would go into Pelham, Georgia, and experience that world with her. She would pay us. She had pecan trees in her yard, and she would allow us to go and pick those up, and would let us go into town and sell them. And she would take half of the profit, of $4 that we made off of collecting these things. It was just a way, I think, it was her way of inviting us into the rhythms of life that she lived and experienced. The house that she was in, and still in our family. It was her mother's house. She took it over. My great grandmother was still alive when I was a child and lived in the house with her. My father was born in that house. My cousin now owns that house. And so just really a wonderful place to enter into the slow experiences of Southern life.
Yeah. Oh. Did she teach you to cook?
She was a terrific cook. There were certain meals. She didn't teach me to cook, but she knew there were things that we were going to have if I was there. And one example is, she had a kind of a walk-in cupboard off the kitchen, and there would always be an angel food cake. If we arrived, there was always an angel food cake waiting, and that's just my favorite kind of cake. That kind of thing.
When you make grits, my wife is in seventh heaven, you know, because she says there's something special about. So what's so special about your grits?
Yeah, right.
You want to tell us your secret?
I don't really have a secret. It's I think it's because people in our community here don't eat grits a lot.
That's right.
And my comment about grits is that it's just an excuse to have salt and butter. That's what grits are for. Put a lot of salt, a lot of butter on them, and you'll be okay. That really was really part of my family, though. My father, again, and I'm sure coming from my grandmother, although I don't really remember my grandmother, her relationship with grits, but certainly my father.
Your father.
Yeah, he would cook them. He was in the kitchen, very comfortable in the kitchen, and so grits would come from him. Grits, scrambled eggs, sausage or bacon. That was a Saturday or Sunday morning for us.
My mouth is watering
Yeah,
just thinking
that's right.
about it.
That's right. Good.
So, as you were growing up, what happened to stories in your life? Did they always stay there, or did you find yourself at a time when you weren't telling stories?
I think that's right. I think that as I moved into high school and even into college, even the notion of thinking about stories or narrative in one's life dropped back. I think the sort of demands of being an adolescent and young adult sometimes pulls away our attention to sort of the ebb and flow of life, the narrative flow of life. We become, not everyone, but we can become absorbed with the daily expectations, the horizon that seems just in front of us that we have to respond to in some way. I think that happened to me. I think it happens to people today. Again, not always. There are always students who are very fascinated with storytelling and with narrative and how that plays. They do it through poetry, and they do it through song and music, and they do it through plays and interactions. I didn't think that way, though. I didn't think about it in these terms when I was
How
that age.
how did you think about it?
Well, I think I was just kind of absorbed with with daily life. I did track, in some sense. I had a journal that I kept about my life through high school. I think at one point I had 1,300 pages
1,300
of just sort of writing about what's happening each day. I didn't think of it in the kind of terms that you're talking about or that we're talking about today. I thought of it as a inner conversation about the arc of life. But again, I wouldn't have used those terms.
But that's very hopeful to be, because we don't want to just simply say there's only one word, there's only one phrase. It's really about life, and so when we share our life, that's what's important.
I think that's right. So I think that we can use the word story, and often we narrow what we think happens when we quote tell a story. There's a certain kind of a setup that we imagine, but I think we're narrating our lives all the time, and we are part of an arc, a movement from beginning to middle to end, and that's what makes a story. So our whole life becomes telling a story, which I think is really important. And I think we're often puzzled about how our private story or our network of stories interacts with grand stories, the meaning of life. How do we fit in with the world, with the universe? And those are important topics that I don't know that we always bring into concrete form, that we don't think specifically about that, but I think it's happening, and I think that's what makes storytelling so rich. When you're participating in a good story with someone, they're telling either about something that happened to them. They might not think of it like I'm going to tell you a story now, but they just start talking about something that's happened. Then the good ones are ones that somehow connect you to your own story and to big stories, and have you somehow sense something important is happening in
You
our
said some
future.
very interesting words, and you talked about the narrative, and about the grand sweep, and about your own story and your big story. In the academic world, is that is that called hold, or is there another disciplined way of how much the facts that you had to have? And
Well, I think there are disciplines. There are whole disciplines that think this way in some ways. Narrative psychotherapy is a field of study that you could think of in which you really are listening for, in some sense, the arc of one's story, how one narrates one's life, and ways in which we tell ourselves problematic stories about ourselves, and that's in some ways we think about that as simply self-criticism. I'm criticizing myself. I have a little voice in my head that's criticizing myself. But in some ways that becomes a problem-saturated story, a story about my life that begins to become dominated by pain and problem. And that's not unusual and not necessarily bad. It's noticing that that's what's happening. It's like, wow, I wonder what's happening in my life right now that's leading me into that space. And sometimes sharing that with another person, and like we said a few minutes ago, feeling heard in that space begins to open the door for, in some sense, telling a different story. There are psychologists who talk about, are you telling the story you intend to tell about your life or with your life? And so there are disciplines that...
That's a good question, isn't it?
Talk in that way. I think it's a really good question.
Yeah. Now, as you look at a broad scope of life and the kind of world we're in right now, and without asking you to solve all the world's problems, what do you see narrative, all the words you've been using, how do you see them relating to helping us cope in this world that we live in?
In some ways, I think it helps when we connect our personal story, within which we can become sometimes consumed. But when we can connect that to broader community stories, what's happening in my community, national stories, a story like environmental change is a big story about the world. Sometimes people feel disconnected from those larger stories. But when we have a summer like we've had this year, people begin to think in those terms. I think about it not so much as becoming alarmist about that, but rather, this is what's happening in our world. How do I want to participate in that bigger story of what's happening? There are moments when we need to retreat and just take care of what's happening in our life because there are things that are happening for us. But there are spaces, I think, when we can tap into or touch or step into this bigger and longer story that's going on about our world, about poverty in our world. And it's not simply looking at pictures of young children who might be hungry in another world, but how do I participate in their story? How do we link one another together to take seriously that we are people in a shared world?
Are there? We have some more time, but we're coming down to that time when we have to say so long. But are there some things about that you've thought about that you want to share that I'm not asking you, and just you'd like to share with people who have a chance to see this?
Well, I guess I would speak, we've talked about most of this, I would speak out of my own experience in one setting in which I'm sitting with an individual who's talking about what's happening in their life and the importance of having spaces where we can do that, where we can talk really openly about our stories, our lives, what is good and what is bad, and to feel heard. So that's one level that I think is very important for each of us. And connecting that, when we can, as we were just talking about, to grander narratives, to overarching meaning of life. Not that we solve that, not that we have an answer for that, but that every day is another day of participating in that kind of conversation back and forth.
That's very helpful. We really thank you for coming and being part of this conversation. Hope we can continue it and talk again at another time.
Thanks, and really good to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Sure. Thank you. Welcome, everybody, and goodbye. Those are the two good words. You're welcome, and you're always sent with blessing upon your way.